Shalom. God bless you guys in the name of Yeshua HaMashiach. The Seventh-Day Adventists. Seventh-Day Adventists. Before I begin the Seventh-Day Adventist study, first I need to be historically accurate. So before I begin with the actual Seventh-Day Adventist body as a movement, I need to discuss about their historical background, their leaders, and so forth. I'll begin with Mr. William Miller first. Seventh-Day Adventism. Begin with the people involved as Mr. William Miller. To be fair to the Seventh-Day Adventist group, good history is both sides, so I need to acknowledge them first in their side of things, beginning with their leaders though. So I'll begin covering, in this video I'll just be covering Mr. Miller and the Millerites, and a little bit of their history themselves, what era they were living in, and before we jump into the Seventh-Day Adventist on another video. This video will be a preface to the actual video study as a heavy background, so that by the time we get to the Seventh-Day Adventist video, we have an idea what we're dealing with. So let's begin. Mr. Miller, born in 1782, and he passed away 1849. His occupation, he was a farmer. He was actually in the military. He wasn't a Sabbatarian, or he wasn't ascribed to the Sabbatarian theology. He was actually a Baptist in origin, in his upbringing. Actually, he began as a Baptist minister, an author, and we know leader of the Millerite movement. Millerites. So that's a little bit about his background. So he was a farmer. He was in the military. He was a Baptist by origin, and he was a leader of the Millerites. And okay, let's jump right into his life a little further. Let's get into this. Now, bear in mind, he was relatively young when he passed away, 67. In those days, people didn't really live long, so it was a hard life back in those days. Really hard. The spouse of his, of course, it was Lucy Smith. Lucy Smith. That's the spouse. Yes, spouse. He had 5 children. So let's start with this Baptist. So he began preaching as a Baptist, and we must understand during this time something happened. The Second Great Awakening. So there was a revival in the United States, a lot of spiritual revival amongst the churches. Good movements came out of this, bad movements came out of this. One of these bad movements is the Mormons. Mormons were also part of the Great Enlightenment experience, but again, it's like what happened in the 70s, the revivals with the hippie movement. Good branches came out of that, like a good solid teachers, like from the Calvary Chapel movement, but other were kooky, like the Children of God, who began right but ended up being a sex cult, and it's terrible. But again, it's the Second Great Awakening happened, so it brought with new ideals, and the new ideals were a revigorating, a revival of a revival and a zeal for the second coming of Christ. So that was renewed. That was renewed in Europe first, but gradually, of course, the fire came to this side of the world of the Second Great Awakening. So after a while, when he was growing up, so in 1803 he married Lucy Smith. He moved to Pulteney, and there he became a farmer. However, this was the time when he started, after being there a short time or some period, he rejected his Baptist heritage. So he became a deist. And bear in mind, he was also, as we said, he was a military. In the military, he was also an American Revolution veteran. So he went through the American Revolution. He's experienced that, the horrors and just the horrendous. If you know history, you know what I'm talking about. Now, during his military service, something happened to him too. In the outbreak of the war, when it reached to the date of 1812, he was basically, by this time he was a ranked lieutenant. He was in a tough fort. In fact, it was a very vulnerable fort. So severely outnumbered American forces against the British. They were basically just attacking this fort just tirelessly. They were just attacking this fort. As they called them at the time, the redcoats, they just kept coming because we must understand also the British Empire was a powerful empire, and it didn't really lose its power until after the Second World War, because by that time, of course, they had a financial crisis in their hands. That's why they were very, very literally, they were almost breached by the Third Reich, because during World War II, again, we must understand, Winston Churchill, his empire was in a financial bind. He was on thin ice. That's why the United States came at a perfect time to defend him or to help him. But it cost him, because the treaty was, we'll help you with supplies and we'll back you up, we'll assist you, but hand over your island territories. And he did. That was a tough deal, because the empire basically lost its islands in the Caribbean, lost its islands in the south, basically lost land everywhere where it conquered before. So once this fort was attacked, and basically attacked from every direction, and Mr. Miller was not harmed. So he, in his mind, wow, it's a miracle. And bear in mind, at this point, he's still a deist. A miracle. That's a miracle. It's like, what are the chances? I'm a deist. You know what? God is not only the creator and simply left us high and dry, but the miraculous unharm that I did not receive from any of these attacks. Very slim, especially vastly outnumbered. So I must be some type of a messenger from the Lord, a godsend. So this, which really, once this happened, this really lifted his veil of deism. Once this happened at the fort, in 1814, once this happened at the fort of 1814, he saw it as a miracle that that distant God in deism promotes. He said, you know what, that can't be true anymore because he saved me. So his deistic mentality was erased. Basically, that's what sealed and confirmed that God is not a distant God. He's a very involved God. So this was after, and I quote him, he says here, "It seemed to me that the Supreme Being must have watched over the interests of this country in a special manner, and delivered us from the hands of our enemies. So surprising a result against such odds did seem to me like the work of a mightier power than man." So this was the beginning of his from turning from deism back to spiritual life. So he had a spiritual epitome there. Now, Mr. Miller was concerned, deeply concerned, with the question of death and the afterlife. This reflection upon his own mortality followed the recent details of his father and sister, and his experiences as a soldier in the war. Again, the war in those times, it's horrific. It's horrific. So you can understand why people in those days, they were desperate to seek for answers, just like today. But today, obviously, when we fight wars, I mean, there's still horrific stuff, don't get me wrong, but it's now it's more of a computer war, a computerized war. This is not to say we don't have still boots on the ground. We do, obviously, but there's a new kind of warfare now, cybernetic warfare, cyber warfare, satellite warfare, and so forth. Before, you literally, your commanders have to be on the field with you, in front. Now the commanders, they don't have to do that, you know. So soldiers in those times, the men, bloody, especially with the weaponry they use. They use the musket, the little balls, the iron balls. They did a lot of damage, severe damage, disfiguring people. That's why he was so concerned with the afterlife, after the horrors he witnessed and the accounts he witnessed, no doubt. Now, Mr. Miller also, he had two conclusions what happens after death. Either A, you become annihilated, or B, accountability. Now, bear in mind the annihilationist doctrine. It's an old doctrine, annihilationism, and that's where we must understand the annihilationist is to cease. You cease to, basically, you're not there anymore. You're just annihilated. That's the, and that's tied together with soul sleep. We'll cover that later in the Seventh-Day Adventist video, but it's connected to that soul sleep. They use soul sleep, and they use this to back it up. Annihilationism is an ancient view. It's nothing new. So Mr. Miller adopted this view because he felt uncomfortable so he reached two conclusions. Annihilationism, which is an ancient view, which is nothing new, or when a person dies, he's held accountable for his life in the Bema seat of Christ if he's a believer, or the white throne judgment if he's an unbeliever. However, Mr. Miller was not comfortable with either concept. he was not comfortable with either concept. Neither concept. So now after he left Pulteney, now he came back to his return to Lowhampton. So now he came back to Lowhampton. He took steps to try to reestablish his Baptist faith. Because remember, he became a deist. So now he was going back to being a Baptist. What he was brought up with, his roots. Okay? Baptist. Now at first, remember, the struggle was real. It's not like he could go on the internet and check out other books across Europe, of theology books that has to do with the good sound doctrine concerning death. So naturally he tried to combine deism while he was attending with this Baptist congregation. Baptist. So he was in a conflict. He was conflicted. You see the conflict there. Something was wrong. Something fundamental was wrong. And again, he was struggling. He saw a lot in his life. And again, this is a time when people worldwide, they were revived in their zeal for the second coming of Christ. He can come back any moment. That was the zeal. That was one of the results of the Second Great Awakening. And Mr. Miller was part of it. He was along for the ride. So, after he was in his Baptist church, the preacher there, he was absent several times. So they had Mr. Miller preach. Even bear in mind, he was still struggling. So he preached several sermons, but one sermon in particular, when he was preaching about the duties of parents, and of course there was children there, and so he choked up. He choked up because remember, he had kids, so he was in a tough spot. So it's kind of, if you're struggling with something and you're preaching on a subject that profoundly, intimately brushes that topic that you're struggling with. So at this point, again, he was still conflicted. So, but at this point, he was choked and he was very emotional. And here, and I quote him, it says here that there might be a being so good and compassionate as to himself to atone for our transgressions and thereby save us from suffering the penalty of sin. And I immediately felt how lovely such a being must be. And I imagined that I could cast myself into the arms of and trust the mercy of such a one. End of quote there. And again, so his deism was obliterated. So by that emotional sermon he gave. But naturally, of course, what happened after, his deist friends, put F, they challenged him. They challenged him to justify his newly found faith. So, and he quoted, and he stated this. He says, If he would give me time, I would harmonize all the apparent contradictions to my own satisfaction, or I will be a deist still. So he basically said, hey, just give me some time. He basically said, look, just give me some time to study, and I'll answer your questions as best as I can. And again, he was in a time when there was no Bible concordances, It was a tough time too to be a believer in that time. Um, Very tough, very tough. You got a lot to consider. The environment in that society, the American society at that time, it wasn't the society as we know today. The American society back in those days, it was a very pressing, a very violent, a very horrific society, a hard society for a lot of people, especially if you didn't have a lot of income flowing in. Same thing today. It's the same thing today. But so now they were challenging him. So he went through the Bible, and gradually he concluded this, that post-millennialism is no good. Post-millennialism is no good. So he adopted post-millennialism. He stated it was false. He reached a conclusion of his studying the word beginning with Genesis 1. Beginning with Genesis 1:1. Concluded with a prophetic timetable which he adopted called the 2300 days prophecy. And in its relation with the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel. So he used particularly the book of Daniel, but even more particularly when he isolated the reading into Daniel 8:14, and he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be vindicated. Now, Mr. Miller, the vindication, the cleansing of the sanctuary in Miller's mind was the cleansing, of the earth by Jesus' second coming. So when Jesus would come in his predicted date, Jesus would clean up the sanctuary. That's the world in that interpretation. He viewed it, the sanctuary. He viewed the sanctuary and he tied it with the world. And that was his first mistake. And from the calculation from Daniel and the rebuilding of the temple from Artaxerxes, then he computated even more mathematics. So he using the 20 again. He was using the 20. So he used it for both the second coming, of course, but also concerning the temple, and especially when it was rebuilt by Artaxerxes the first of Persia. So then he computated that number, and from the time of the rebuilt temple of Persia, he concluded that, and I quote him, he says, I thus brought to the solemn conclusion that in about 25 years from that time, 1818, all the affairs of our present state would be wound up. Now he made that statement in 1818, but he didn't release it until 1823. In the publication, and I'll quote him again. I rather quote him. He says, I believe that the second coming of Jesus Christ is near, even at the door, even within 21 years, on or before 1843. So he published articles and he spread them to the public later on. and he made, because it was, again, you can only do so much in those days, so he couldn't respond to every piece of mail at that time. So he made a 64 answer tract of his view. 64, like a Bible tract in a way, a Bible tract. So another thing too, Mr. Miller, he was also involved with Freemasons. He was a Freemason. Of course, he later discarded it. He basically abandoned it, but he was a Freemason nonetheless. So, Freemason, he was a Freemason for some time, but then of course he didn't. He couldn't mix it. Of course, he disregarded it, and he said you have to avoid that type of fellowship, regard it like you would any other evil, Freemasonry. And a little bit about the model. Since Cyrus, from 457 BC, basically what he did was he basically computed the numbers, and I'll just break it down very briefly. This is very detailed. Bear in mind, he's still using this type of math formulae to compute the numbers. Then from here, it goes forward again. 457 plus 2300 plus 1 minus 1844, and in the end he got 1844 AD. That's the date of Jesus' second coming. That's what he concluded with. That was a big mistake because he was doing something exactly directly against what Jesus said not to do. Jesus said nobody knows the day or the hour, and he said it as in the human aspect, because obviously now he does know, as our high priest in his heavenly glorified state, but as a human bondservant, as in the human sense, as our example, we are not to set dates. So his mistake, he used wrong method. He also set a date. That's what gets trouble. Set date. So there's 3 errors now. One, then he used the wrong method, the timeline, and set the date. This is the most critical here. Set dates, that's the red flag. That's terrible. You never set dates. You stay away from setting dates. You can pay attention to the seasons, but that's completely different than setting dates. So after this, before the date struck, Millerism, the actual Millerism group, was very loose, very obscure. It was like nobody knew about it. Then it became more publicized. Now they were at the national identity level, and he was a publisher, a pastor also, but he didn't agree fully with Mr. Miller, the views. He was negatively not on board with Mr. Miller's views. Now, when he made that calendar, and we must be very careful, he hasn't had the publicity yet. Mr. Miller, he narrowed down the date. He set the date, but very loosely. very loosely. And that's exactly what Jesus said. Don't do that stuff. Don't even set don't even set a date, even in the broad scale, because again, seasons is different, completely different. You can pay attention to the season and know if there's going to be a fruitful work of the ministry and so forth. But when it concerns in the time frame of the prophetical, that is a completely different time frame. We got to be careful with that. Now, even though he didn't go public, but his supporters were urging him and pushing him, give us the date, please. But of course, Mr. Miller, since reading the Bible, he knew himself not to set any hard dates. But again, the pressure was building, and using the chart, even though he made the chart, so after setting the narrow date, that's when he started getting into deeper trouble. When you start narrowing things down, fundamental things down, and you really have no room for error, you're in dangerous ice, dangerous ground, very thin ice. You can't escape it. It's hard to escape. Once you put yourself in that position, it's hard to get out. That's why you never set dates, either broadly, narrowly. We go by the scripture, what the prophets say, what they have been saying, what they said already. However, the first date he set was in March 21st, 1844. So this one failed, and there was no much incident, not much of a ruckus amongst the people, and he had to do something quick, so he changed it using not the Gregorian calendar, which we use Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, but he used the Karaite calendar. The Karaite calendar, which led him to April 18. And of course, this one failed as well. It's twice, it's 2 strikes. So he set dates twice already. 2 times he set dates and they failed. He did apologize publicly. But we already know the damage is done. Once you do something like that, it's once you get a scar in life, you can't, even though it heals, it's still there. It's going to be there as a reminder. So he did publicly apologize, and I quote him, "I confess my error and acknowledge my disappointment." That's what this was called, the Great Disappointment. The Great Disappointment of the people. "Yet I still believe that the day of the Lord is near, even at the door." Now, a little bit after that, in August of 1844, there was a camp meeting in New Hampshire, which Mr. Samuel S. presented a message that became known as the seventh month message. The 7th month message. The problem with him too was he used that 2300-day model, and he used the Jewish calendar. He used the Karaite calendar, and he concluded as well that Jesus' second coming would return on the 10th day of the 7th month that year. So he concluded it's going to be in October 1844. Another problem there. Another problem. October 22nd, 1844. So this October date, 22nd, 1844, was known as I stated earlier, the Great Disappointment. And basically, and I quote one gentleman by the name of Hiram Edson, recorded of the Millerites. Now there were Millerites, Millerite movement. It had a lot of people. And he stated, "Our fondest hopes, expectations were blasted, and such a spirit of weeping came over us as I never experienced before. We wept and wept till the day dawned. Following the, again, it broke a lot of people's hearts, okay? It broke a lot of people's hearts. It disillusioned the people's hopes. It turned them off, turned them away from Christ, because of one obscure man who used wrong methods, who adopted certain views like that confused him. This man was a veteran, no doubt. I respect him for that. But this is what happens when you bring mixed ideas into the scripture and you have something of a theological fundamental error. And this is what happens. You start setting dates. You bring great disappointment, not only to your name, not only to the people who follow this movement, but to Christ's name. To Christ's name. Now, at that time, the estimation of the believers of the Millerites were between 50,000 and 500,000. His legacy basically sprouted these later on: the Seventh-Day Adventists, the Advent Christian Church. After the Millerites, of course, the Millerites as a movement, it collapsed eventually, and a lot of people left feeling disillusioned. They basically gave up their beliefs. And remember, this is after the Second Great Awakening, when people were zealous in coming to the Lord. There's nothing worse than somebody zealous who actually had a encounter with Christ than to be disappointed. It's kind of like you barely get married or something, then your wife, your bride, God forbid, or your husband dies that same night. It's like you reach the top of the world, then next thing you know, you're disillusioned. It's like, what was it all for? What happened? Mr. Miller. Now, he wasn't the only one. To be fair to Mr. Miller, he wasn't the first to use actually the so-called, Mr. Miller actually didn't invent the 2300 day model. He actually got it from a archbishop by the name of Uso, and interpreting 300 days into years. And that's to be fair to Mr. Miller. He did a grave error yes, many grave errors by setting dates and so forth, especially adopting a view from Archbishop User, who created this, or who adopted the idea, instead of using the days, and he interprets them to years. And that's why Mr. Miller, a student who adopted this view, that's why he fell into error. That's why he adopted this view, and it's terrible. Let's do a little recap here. The Millerites, or Mr. Miller, he adopted the view from Archbishop Uster. This, again, he really popularized the idea of a 2300 days from the book of Daniel, and he made it into years, which was a huge mistake. Now, the great disappointment was actually the disbanding of the Millerites. So, from the Millerites, when they were disbanded, you had several groups. The First-Day Adventists. You had other groups like Seventh-Day Adventists. Eventually that came out from them. And our concern in this video here is to build up our historical account for the Seventh-Day Adventist Church. So we're not going to be focusing on the First-Day Adventists. We're going to be focusing on the Seventh-Day Adventists. We must understand also, Mr. Miller was not a Seventh-Day Adventist. He was not a Seventh-Day Adventist. He had no confidence in the new theories, in the new thoughts that were coming out of the shambles of the Millerite movement. Now, in Mr. Leroy from the Theological Seminary of the current Seventh-Day Adventists. Now, Mr. Leroy Froome, a theological seminary, a theologian from the Theological Seminary of Seventh-Day Adventism, at the time he said, Leroy Froome, a strong voice in the Seventh-Day Adventist Theological Seminary of Tacoma Park, Washington, D.C., in the 4th volume of his masterful series, The Prophetic Faith of Our Fathers, pages 828 and 29, he said, Miller was outspokenly opposed to the various new theories that had developed following October 1844, the Great Disappointment. In an endeavor to explain the disappointment, he deplored the call to come out to the churches that had been given. He never accepted the distinctive positions of the Sabbatarians. So Miller, the doctrine of unconscious sleep of the dead and the final destruction of the wicked was not, he maintained. Part of the original Millerite position, but was introduced personally by George Storrs and Charles Fitch. He even came to deny the application of the parable, the Midnight Cry, to the seventh-month movement, and eventually went so far to declare unequivocally that the movement was not a fulfillment of prophecy in any sense. Because he knew by his setting dates that was an error, and his conscience was bugging him. So he knew nothing. Since he was the leader at one point and he messed up, what was going to be, I mean, think about it. If you're there and you messed up, you put a little bit of poison in the water, but not enough to kill, just simply to get people disoriented. If those people are disoriented, disillusionized, how much more confusion are they going to bring to the table? You understand? That's why Mr. Miller was disagreeing with the Sabbatarians' new thought. They were bringing new ideas to try to explain the great disappointment. So, Mr. Miller denied several doctrines of the Seventh-day Adventists, like denied Seventh-day Adventist doctrine. Number 1, he denied seventh-day Sabbath. 2, he denied the doctrine of sleep soul, the utter destruction of the wicked. And 4, he never embraced the sanctuary and the investigative judgment theories developed by the Seventh-day Adventists. Notice, these are all key doctrines of the Seventh-day Adventists, even to this day. They believe in the maintaining the Sabbath, the sleep soul, or the annihilationism. It's annihilationism. It's another. Again, it's an ancient heresy. It's an ancient doctrine. It's based upon heretical thought. It's not even biblical. It's a heretical thing. It's heresy. It's heresy. It's annihilationism. There's no exegetical proof that and I did explain this, I believe, in my hell video. I might do another hell video, but speaking about hell. But yeah, it's in my other video, because a lot of people can't accept that a loving God. But first of all, they have a not a confused image of God. I wouldn't say that, but maybe a certain aspect of their view that can be one-sided of God. And that's why it's hard for them to accept that a loving God, why would he send people to hell to torture them? And I talked to a few people, and it's sensible, but we must understand also, nobody's in hell because God put them there. Everybody that's in hell are there because they put themselves there. It's the freedom of choice, because God will not violate your free will if you want to rebel. This is not to say God's not going to send people your way, or he can't speak to you where you are. I'm not limiting God by any means. But if you get to a point in your life where you really you don't care, you just don't really care, you just want to go your way, then God's not going to force you. The worst thing he can do is to take you to heaven if you don't want to be in heaven, because heaven will be hell for you. Heaven will be hell for you. So Mr. Miller denied these. He wasn't agreeing with these doctrines here. Mr. Miller was a mess. He brought a mess. He made a mess. And from his mess, while this mess was going on, there was other leaders in different regions. And now it's gonna... I'll just put these leaders down for the build-up. There was one leader named, and I mentioned him before, Hiram Edson, New York. And these are important people, because these three individual leaders of groups, they're going to come together, which is going to form the establishment of the Sabbath worship, the Seventh-day Adventist fellowship. He advocated his ministry. What he did, he was embracing the special or final ministry of Christ in the Holy of Holies, the sanctuary. So that's what he emphasized. He was very zealous. Lord, you're in the Holy of Holies. You are in the heavenly sanctuary. And he was basically preaching, you guys better repent because the hour is coming, judgment is coming. And the judgment has come. That's the first guy, the first gentleman. The second was Mr. Bates. He advocated the observance of the Sabbath law. Number 3, Mr. Bates. That's Mr. Bates. The third group was in Maine. Now this group was a loose group. They were heavily emphasizing the spirit of prophecy, especially Revelation 14, 6 to 12. That was one of their fundamentals. Revelations 12:17, 19:10, and or God's last segment of God's church in the centuries, of the centuries. Basically, the last remnant in time. And these three groups will mesh together and make what we call today the group Seventh-Day Adventists. My next video, Lord willingly, will be covering the actual Seventh-Day Adventists. Prior though, beginning with some of these individuals still, but also covering Mrs. Ellen G. White. It's very important to cover the actual people involved in construction of the body of the Seventh-Day Adventist group before we get into the group themselves. Shalom. God bless you guys, and remember, please do not set any dates. Do not set any dates. We see the damage done, especially in today, which is so tempting to set any date without really investigating, but above all, without waiting, without praying and waiting, and simply going online and so easily downloading a picture and posting it in your website and giving fast facts without checking them out first. God bless you guys.